JLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to the second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier over 100 sessions featuring a stellar list of writers, thinkers, philosophers, doctors, scientists, economists, including George Saunders, Margaret Atwood, Edmund de Waal, Peter Carey, Tom Coiben, Oran Pamuk, Howard Jacobson, and so many others. You can watch these on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest, JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our next session today is Aladdin and the Other Marvelous Tales, featuring Paulo Lemos Horta. Writer and translator Paulo Lemos Horta has written on the cultural and literary history of the Arabian Knights and of the travelers, translators, and storytellers who gave the world these unforgettable tales in his Marvellous Thieves, Secret Authors of the Arabian Nights, and Aladdin, a new translation. In Aladdin, Horta takes us on a dazzling journey, interweaving and reinventing the dark themes and enchanting whimsy of a classic that has transfixed us for ages. In our conversation today, we will delve into the stories behind the stories. Paulo Lemos Horta is the author of Marvellous Thieves and a new translation, Aladdin, a BuzzFeed Best Book of the Year and of cosmopolitanism. Mentions of his work have recently been in a number of publications, especially after the release of the Disney film of Aladdin. And these have appeared in Time, Life, The New Yorker, and The Guardian. His writing has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement and in the LA Review of Books. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below, and I will pose these questions to Paulo at the end of the session. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, remember you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. And in case we drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Aladdin and Other Marvelous Tales with Paulo Lemos Horta. Paulo, where exactly are you? And welcome to JLF's Brave New World.
Hi, Sanjoy. I'm trying to recreate the feeling of being back in Jaipur by being outside in Barcelona in the heat of August, you know. I'm trying to get that Jaipur feeling.
That's not too far from Aleppo or the Turkish coast, or in fact, Morocco, and all of these wonderful places which has influenced the books. And are you there on COVID because of the COVID situation, or are you actually researching and writing of another wonderful book?
I am researching and writing another wonderful book, and you're right. It is the Mediterranean world that the storyteller of Aladdin traveled through, and the French adventurer who brought him and the story to Paris 300 years ago actually did end up in Madrid. So there is a connection, and it is part of this Mediterranean world of corsair pirates and the plague and wars and all sorts of dangers that they faced on their journey to bring us these stories 300 years ago.
And great food and great conspiracy. Paulo, tell us, in 1709, a visit by Antoine Galland to the Paris apartment of his friend Paul Lucas yielded an incredible discovery that would shape the literary legacy thereon. What did he find in Paul Lucas's house? Or rather, who did he meet, or who did he find?
He met this young man who was probably no more than 17 years old, maybe 18. His name was Hana Diab, and Paul Lucas, who's this tomb raider, this treasure hunter from France, would have been in his 40s.
And no relation to George Lucas, I'm assuming.
Well, except they both love stories of the supernatural and of marvelous things, Paul Lucas was actually afraid of snakes. So in a way, there are connections to some of the George Lucas characters. But no, he was, in his own day, Paul Lucas, this tomb raider, procured curiosities for the cabinets of the court. And this was before museums like the Louvre were available. This is the early 1700s, before the revolution in France. And Hana Diab was this young Maronite who had this ability to tell stories, and who was the originator, the known named storyteller behind such stories as Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and Prince Ahmad and the Fairy Banu. So he's actually the most influential named storyteller in literature. He's a very we're aware of this talent of this young man from Aleppo.
But in that initial meeting, why was Lucas so taken with Diab, and what happened in that period? You talk about May 5th to June 2nd, where he relates these 16 or 17 fantastic stories, and that sort of sets Galland into wanting to take Lucas to court. What happened at the point?
Well, Antoine Galland was translating the Arabian Nights. The first volume appeared in 1704. There would be a total of 12.
And this is from Arabic to French, or from
Arabic to French. Unfortunately, the Arabic only gave him about 280 stories or so for Shahrazad to tell. So the ladies at the French court would have been very disappointed that Shahrazad did not have 1,001 nights of storytelling. So we don't know if he already had in mind that he was looking for stories, but he found a storyteller. And the solution he would find after meeting Hannah, and the first meeting, he realized that Hannah had these very beautiful stories from the Arab world. And so we realized he had this enthusiasm for these stories. And then Galland would be the one who would take these stories like Aladdin and Ali Baba that were told to him by Hannah Diab, as you say, over these many story sessions. And he would put them in French into the Arabian Nights. And that's why we have these stories. That's how these stories reached us all from India to Brazil. They came to us via this French translation, which added these stories, Hannah Diab stories, to the Arabian Nights.
And did he sort of credit Diab for the stories, or there was no IP law at that point?
No. That's why I guess that's why I refer to these Orientalist translators as robbers, as thieves. As you know, a lot of statues have been coming down lately of these sort of figures, Orientalists. Adventurers, travelers, tomb raiders, who smuggled mummies out of Egypt, right? And recently we've had a rethink about how heroic they were and how what their contribution to civilization has been. And that's actually what my book, Marvellous Thieves, these marvelous robbers are about. I'm trying to excavate from beneath the reputation of these, the French translator of the Arabian Nights, who was credited as the inventor, the creator, the author of the Arabian Nights. And behind these famous figures, I'm excavating the secret authors of the Arabian Nights, the storytellers from Aleppo, from whom they took the stories and did not, in print, credit them with the stories. Richard Burton would also be a very famous translator of the Arabian Nights in Victorian England. And he was traveled to Mecca and Medina disguised as a Muslim. And there was a whole mythology that he kind of wove about himself that earned him a knighthood in Victorian England. And I think it's very important for us, it's timely to think about, tearing some of these edifices and hero worship down with regard to these figures and figuring out exactly who gave us these stories like Aladdin, which are so vital and elemental and universal. And these stories were actually composed and contributed by Hannah Diab, not by Burton, and not by Antoine Galland, as many books over the centuries have identified Galland as, he elevated the material and made it into French and world literature. And my book is all about where did these stories come from? How were they told? And I think it's the true story of how these stories came to us it's as colorful, as adventurous as an Arabian Nights story.
Paulo, we're going to come back to the origins of this, and of course, the idea of the orphan stories and Diab itself. But will you do a setting for us? I mean, in those days there was no Google, and there was no, you couldn't just go and find a story. And yet, stories is what changed and formed civilizations in those times. They were the most important sort of creative process in courts across. So give us a setting of both what happened in the Arabian Nights context, and who was this princess, and where did she come from, whose invention was it, and then we'll come back to the French court in the process of that.
Yes, Shahrazad is a Persian name. You can hear it, right? And and the king that she's telling the stories to, Shahryar, another Persian name, right? And the whole excuse for her telling the stories is that he's been betrayed. He's a misogynist. He's a killer of women, and he wants to marry a different woman each night and have her killed off in the morning. And Shahrazad is the vizier's daughter, and she volunteers to marry him, which her father, the vizier, finds very confusing. And her plan is to bring her sister Daniyazad, another Persian name, along. And Daniyazad would ask her each night to tell a story, or to continue, more precisely, to continue a story. So the Shahryar, the king, would be kept in suspense, and he would wait to hear the story the next day. This is the frame story of the Arabian Nights. Because of this frame, Shahrazad was able to tell us stories like the Porter and the Free Ladies of Baghdad, the Merchant and the Genie, the Fisherman and the Genie. They're the famous original Arabic stories of the Arabian Nights that were collected and composed in places like Baghdad and Damascus and Cairo. And the oldest manuscript we have in Arabic of these stories dates to the 14th century in Syria. So we know already, even if we just think about this original core of stories, that the frame, just from listening to this, the sound, the musicality of these names, we know that these names are Persian. We know that that frame story actually came from Persia. And then, the folklore scholars have done some research and realized that that actual frame tale originally came from India. Where else? And so what we know is that in these, if you think about places like Baghdad and Damascus and Cairo, they were very important mercantile places. And the Arabian Nights stories have often been referred to as mirror for merchants. Sinbad is a merchant. If you recall the story of Sinbad, he loses his fortune, so he has to go out and make it all up again, and then loses it again and makes it up again. And the stories traveled through the same Silk Road from Asia, right? That carried goods and pepper and spices and the kinds of commodities that populate the stories of Sinbad. The marvels of Sinbad were often very commercial, along with the rook bird and the serpents and the snakes. So in fact, it's good to think of these stories as stories that travel. And imagine if the Canterbury Tales or the Decameron were stories that had begun in India and then moved to the Arab world via Persia, and then finally ended up in France, and each scribe, collator, editor adding their own stories, right? That's the way we can think of the Arabian Nights. It is a story collection like the Decameron or the Canterbury Tales, but perhaps more global still. Of course, the Canterbury Tales and the Decameron stole plots from Arabic and Spanish and Italian literature and so forth, and they were global and international in their own way, but perhaps not quite as cross-cultural, flying across the Indian Ocean, and not quite as East-West in their creation. So the Arabian Nights stories are all an accumulation of these different traditions. And you can imagine, as I say, any of these stories, even just from listening to these names like Shahrazad, that they are already like an onion. You already have the Indian skeleton of that story about the king who was betrayed by his wife. And then that story travels to Persia. And then in the Arab world, it becomes an excuse to tell more stories. It gives us an insight into, as you say, the centrality of stories. Which perhaps in some places, here in Spain, people have been reading like never before. Sometimes illegally. The booksellers are complaining that the illegal downloads of books have gone through the roof. This was not something that was much of a concern before Corona. But imagine a world where this is what you would do. You would, for example, in Damascus and in Aleppo, to come back to our storyteller of Aladdin, Hana Diab, this is what you would do. You would go to what would you do? You would go to the cafe, and for the price of a cup of coffee, there would be a storyteller, right? Nowadays you go to Aleppo or to Cairo, and there's, Mohamed Salah is playing for Liverpool, and that's fine. And these are their own kinds of mythologies and stories that people are gathering around. But imagine a storyteller holding your attention. And he would have to do the same thing that Shahrazad did. He wanted you to come back the next day, so he had to try and keep you in suspense and leave it on a cliffhanger. So you would come back to that same cafe the next day and pay for another cup of coffee, which is why the cafe was hiring the storyteller, and the storyteller was running to the mosque and gathering some pages of manuscripts from the Arabian Nights or some other story collection, and to tell the stories, right? So,
but Paulo, you yourself are a great storyteller. How did your interest to tell these stories come about, and specifically the Arabian Nights, and with your background of travel, give us your sort of background of how this came about.
Well, I have, I guess, a double influence for my family. So on my mother's side, she was an orphan from the north of Brazil. I don't know as much about her family as I would like, her birth family. The first book she was given in Belém in the Amazon, you can imagine these cities that you might know from the films of Werner Herzog and the operas in the jungle and things like that. And she was given this copy of the Arabian Nights when she was 8. It was the first book her adoptive father gave to her. And these were the first stories that she told me when I was a little boy, Ali Baba and Aladdin. And I was very shocked when I was at university and I found out that these stories were French frauds and inventions and, Disney imperialistic ventures. And I thought, well, this can't be right, or is it right? And that's one of the reasons why I myself wanted to do research in this. And I was very happy to be able to answer that, in fact, they're not French frauds, and that these stories, now that we know more about Hannah Diab, because the storyteller from Aleppo has actually left us a memoir, which we couldn't identify for 300 years, but now we have the manuscript. It's even been translated into English and French and German. And so I feel like this is a good thing for me personally, because it means my childhood was not a lie. And my parents had lived in the Middle East before I was born. So growing up on Persian carpets, low Arabic trays with pita bread and Arabic coffee, it was nice that the stories that we were telling and retelling and reenacting with my siblings are genuine Arab tales. So that on that front, I'm very happy. It also so happens that on my father's side, we are descendants of we have a Sephardic background. My family originated here and actually in Spain, where I am now, and in Portugal. And we were kicked out. And I always knew there was something. Actually, I haven't told you the story, Sanjoy, because I've just learned a bit more about it recently. And this is something that only recently I've had 64 pages of genealogical research come into my hands. My cousins had hired genealogists recently, and I now realize that my family on my father's side, we always knew that they had converted from Judaism and immigrated to Latin America, but there was some kind of Middle Eastern interlude. And it turns out that my ancestor actually went from Portugal to Aleppo, where he had family. So he was an Arabic-speaking Jew who, the moment he was kicked out of Portugal, joined the Portuguese as a spy and worked as an intelligence broker in the Ottoman Empire out of Aleppo, where he had family for generations, where there was another branch of this family. Wow. So I find it very interesting how, and this is the world that Hannah inhabited in Aleppo as well. This is a world where, you can imagine a city where Jews and Christians and Muslims lived and, coexisted mostly, not uniformly, but mostly with a relative kind of peace compared to today's world and today's Aleppo, right? And these were multicultural, very cosmopolitan places like Aleppo. And it's thrilling to have a personal connection, family connection to a place like that. And it does, encourage me to tell these stories.
That's amazing. This new connection is just extraordinary. Going back to Hannah Diab, Paulo, so there is Hannah Diab in Paris, and he's taken to the French court, and he is absolutely amazed, and they, of course, look at him as this extraordinary sort of object. And then as he experiences the court and he sees the princesses and their jewels and their brocades and stuff, does he then adopt some of that into his stories of Aladdin and the wonderful palaces? And we see much more similarity there to Versailles as opposed to, say, Topkapi.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly what happens. So we have Hannah Diab is the youngest of several siblings. His father is dead, like Aladdin's father is dead. His mother is melancholic because, well, the death of her husband, but also because her young son will not follow in the family trade. Well, this is true both of Hannah Diab and of Aladdin. Hannah Diab then meets a mysterious sorcerer, a mysterious magician. Paul Lucas was perceived as such in his travels. Repeatedly, he was perceived as a magician, as a sorcerer. There are these uncanny coincidences between Hannah's travels and adventures with Paul Lucas. Their first adventure, they go into an underground vault and they emerge with a ring and a lamp, which are central to the plot of Aladdin. It's possible that this is a remarkable coincidence, but certainly the world that Hannah and Lucas traveled through and inhabited imprints the story of Aladdin. And yes, you're right. The palace, the story of building a palace to woo a princess, that's a story that Hannah hears when he's in Versailles with Paul Lucas. Paul Lucas tells him how Louis XIV, built this whole palace of Versailles to woo this young woman. And that's the story that we have in Aladdin. And yes, as you pointed out, the palace in Aladdin has a lot more physical resemblance. The fountains, the fountain of the lions, very specific details, actually overlap with the palace in Aladdin in a way that these sort of, we imagined for 300 years that maybe Aladdin was a sort of fantasy of the Orient, that the French translator just sort of imagined, or maybe because he had lived in Istanbul for a while, that he was drawing from Topkapi, as you say. But actually the palace in Aladdin, the bejeweled princesses, the way they behave, the way the men and the women interact, the way that they interacted with Hannah, is actually more like the Versailles that Hannah experienced. It's quite possible that Hannah drew from his own life to tell the story of Aladdin. And there's more and more evidence of this.
So in your research, Paulo, what happened? Was it that Hannah was writing these stories out and then giving it to Galland, and he then was translating, or was it a process of Hannah just sort of telling the stories in the palace, which were then written out by Galland, and therefore he sort of owned it and he said, this is the rest of the stories from the Arabian Nights?
It was really, mostly storytelling. So for most of the stories that were added to the Arabian Nights, thanks to Hannah Diab, we know that Galland in his private diary, not in print, not when he published these further volumes of the Arabian Nights, just in his private diary for himself, a little Moleskine-sized pocket diary that you can look at the National Library in Paris. Galland would say, today, Hannah Diab came to me and he told me the story of Ali Baba. Today, Hannah Diab came to me and he told me this story. Now, it's quite likely, perhaps even we're coming closer to being able to confirm as a certainty, that just for a couple of stories, there may have actually been manuscripts that Hannah was involved in producing, either dictating them, enabling them in some way. And those would be the stories of Aladdin and Ali Baba. But what we know for sure so far is that he told these stories. And we know that because Hannah mentions this in his diary that has survived as a book of travels today in manuscript form. And we know this because the French translator confirms this in his diary. So this is one of the wonderful things about this story, is that we have it from both perspectives, which is very rare. We always have these dreams, when we read about cross-cultural collaboration and creation and adventure, to have both the Arab and the French perspective. In this case, we actually do. And that's what allows us to tell a very compelling story and to tell the history of these stories.
You in fact refer to them as orphan tales. This particular body of work. Why is that?
Well, scholars have traditionally referred to these as, I actually don't really like this term. I think that people watching on YouTube will be going, what is this? Because Aladdin's an orphan? That makes him an orphan tale? What the scholars meant were simply being very scholarly. They were going, well, there is no Arabic text, right? So if there's no text, then it's a tale without an origin. But now, actually, I would say these are really, these are Diab tales. I think we should think about Aladdin and Ali Baba and Prince Ahmed and the other 7 stories that he contributed to the Arabian Nights as Hannah Diab's tales. I think that's a much better way of putting it. It's more accurate. It reflects his influence as a storyteller, as I said, is the most influential named storyteller that we have in literature. And I think it's time to, now that we have the Book of Travels by Hannah Diab and we know more about him as the creator of these stories, it's time to put away this term orphan, because that meant we didn't know who the father or the mother of these stories were. And now we know that we do know, and that Hannah was as involved with their creation as the French translator, if not more so, because he created these stories, which the French translator maybe embellished a little and wrote them down. And but the stories were actually told in French by Hannah to galan. So even translation is a weird phrase to describe a story that you're writing down in French from the storyteller, right?
And
And you were,
and did Galan sort of cross Diab's palm with silver? And what happened to Diab thereon? Did he suddenly disappear like the palace into the desert, or is do we know what happened to him? Is there a sort of happy ending or a sad ending to Diab's own story?
well, I would say there's probably both a sad and a happy ending. I mean, Diab, when we encounter him in his memoirs, when he was very young, a teenager, he wanted to see the world. He was impatient. He had 4 older brothers. He didn't want to wait for his stand in the souk. That could have taken years. All the older brothers that would have to get established first. So he met this French adventurer, and he did get to travel the world. So in that sense, it's happy. But he had a lot of heartbreak along the way. I mean, Paul Lucas promised him that he would give him a job as librarian to the king in charge of Arabic books. That was never going to happen. That was like the Maghrebi magician and Aladdin. That was a lie to dangled in front of him to get him to come along with him on his adventures. And Hana even he almost got married in Paris when he was there for about a year in 1709. The first cafetier in Paris was another Arab Christian, and he wanted Hana to marry his daughter and to take over his cafe so he could set one up in Versailles for the court. And Paul Lucas interfered and said no, and so there was actually a lot of heartbreak. You can imagine the story going differently. Hana was wrongfully arrested for stealing some jewels. Again, it's something out of the Arabian Knights in Paris, and he had that very bitter experience as he was being dragged across Paris by these people who were likely going to torture him to find out where these jewels that his friend had were. And he managed to escape from this arrest, but he had some bitter heartbreak. He had some disappointments. He might have married the cafetier's daughter. He might have established himself well in Paris. He might not have been arrested and faced this threat of torture and violence. And then he left in a very bitter way because Lucas's promises were not materialized. Galan had his own lies and promises. Galan said, "Oh, I'm going to set you up as tomb raider, procurer of curiosities, treasure hunter. You can do this without Lucas. And I know somebody very important, a patron. He's going to set you up." And this didn't come to anything either. So Hana got fed up with Paris. Unfortunately, Lucas had blocked his chance to get married, of personal happiness and professional management of this cafe. Lucas and Galan had both lied to him and misled him because they wanted his stories for themselves. They wanted his knowledge for themselves, which is why we're tearing down these statues now, right? I think there was a lack of acknowledgement of where this knowledge came from. And the Arabian Nights was the literary phenomenon of its day. It was the Harry Potter of its time. So this was a very valuable, these were these fervor volumes that Hana enabled, these 4 volumes that would not have been, of the 12 of the Arabian Nights in French, that would not have existed were it not for Hana. They really cemented the reputation of the Arabian Nights in world literature, and they gave us this wonderful collection of stories so important to Bollywood and to Hollywood. So Hana was crucial to that, and he didn't get to the credit until now. He did go back to Aleppo, and he capitalized on all these amazing experiences and adventures that he had, mercantile contacts that he had. And our best knowledge, based on census data, is that he did eventually get married and owned one of the biggest houses of Aleppo. So became a very powerful merchant. And in that sense, that's a happy ending.
I'm going to, because of the lack of time, Paulo, I'm going to sort of fast forward to 100 years later to Henry Torrance in Calcutta. And Henry Torrance is in Calcutta. He's got hold of a manuscript. There's some sense that these are stories that have actually been doing the rounds in India before they went off through the Orient and down the Silk Route, etc. So it wasn't necessarily just Diab's inventions, but these were earlier inventions, pretty much like what happened with what they call the Arabic number, which was actually the Hindu number, which was from Mount Abu, and that traveled its way and became the Arabic number. Tell us a little bit about Henry Torrance and how and what was his place in making these stories, and And perhaps if we have time, I'm going to ask you about why is it that the English then wanted to water down some of the
Yes.
translations of how these magnificent women warriors that
Yes.
featured in the stories were then written out in different ways.
So we were talking about the first translation into French. That was by Galland, and he had Hannah Diab's help. The first translation from Arabic into English took place in India in the 1830s. And the context was Henry Torrance, that you mentioned, was actually somebody who opposed the new policy, the Minuteman education, this policy that only this idea that one shelf of English literature was worth all the libraries of the East, right? So Torrance fiercely opposed that. He wanted to contribute to the Asiatic Society and to publish actually texts in Urdu and in other non-Western languages. And that's why in fact, he wanted to publish the Arabian Nights in Arabic, not in English. But the English would only fund it because they were in this moment of only English matters and shifting the language of education in India and a bureaucracy in India to English. They only funded the Arabic publication by saying, well, you must translate it into English. So that's the context in India. Torrance was actually one of the Freemasons in India that was opening up these temples to locals, not just to the Scots and the colonial Brits. And he was an idealist, and in many ways he was at the wrong time, as the English were, being imperialists and trying to invade Afghanistan and engaging in all sorts of imperialist misadventures. But this is the bigger text. If you buy the Penguin edition of the Arabian Nights, or if you want an edition of the Arabian Nights, which actually gives you 1001 nights of storytelling, then this is the text that was edited in Arabic and translated into English for the first time in India. And this is the more complete text. Remember the one that Galland had in France had only about 280 nights, right? So this is a much more comprehensive text. And there's some people who even believe that the versions of the stories, even the same stories that recur in both manuscripts, are somehow richer and more literary and have. So the people who like the Macnaghten text, this text is Indian Calcutta 2 text that we're referring to, they think it's the more complete and the richer version of the Arabian Nights. And because of this history, we have the Arabian Nights in English.
And yet the Asiatic Society or the laws at that point of time, they didn't want him to translate it word to word. They wanted him to sort of do a sort of watered down version, yes, because there's so much of sexuality and so much of power to the woman. Tell us a little bit about that, about the woman being empowered in these texts.
Maybe it's because he was a Freemason and a liberal, and he founded some of the first newspapers in northern India. But Henry Torrance actually kept a lot of these strong women and even the sexual content of the Arabian Nights. It's the subsequent translators, Victorians like Edward Lane, who would come and feel very uncomfortable. And when I did the comparison of Edward Lane and the stories he kept when he was translating in Cairo from the Bulak, I came across this basically the finding that he was cutting out a lot of the strong women characters that in fact are present in the Macnaghten text that was compiled in India, and that Torrance was trying to keep in the Arabian Nights. But for some reason, the way the Arabian Nights evolved in English, we barely hear about Macnaghten or Torrance or the first translation that was done in India. And we hear more about these adventurers like Lane, who claims he was on ropes swinging into tombs and, on the outskirts of Cairo and Alexandria, and, cavorting with jinn in caves and dressing like and living as an Arab and as a Muslim in Cairo. Or Richard Burton later, traveling to Mecca and Medina, disguised as a Muslim. I think, unfortunately, the romance of Lane's cultural immersion in Cairo or Burton's adventures disguised as an Arab has trumped the actual work of editing or the actual compilation, the richer work that was done in India before. And even some of the idealism that Torrance had, as I say, as a Freemason, who was thinking in a less hierarchical way about the relationship between East and West, in a more open way, I would say. So unfortunately, as British imperialism hardened towards the end of the 19th century, The English became less open or less interested in these stories of the strong women, but really in the wider story of the Arabian Nights, right? That's the real loss, I would say, in that regard.
What is interesting is that, pre 1857, most of the British in India assimilated with the local culture. So they dressed like the locals, they behaved like the locals, they had 17 wives, and they perambulated on their elephants around, etc. And what is equally interesting with Henry Torrance is the fact that he then fought for freedom of expression in many
Yes,
ways, and he went to court, and he was very happy that, I think it was Hastings or I forget who the viceroy was at that point of time. He was very happy that that sort of law came into being.
Yeah, I mean, I think Torrance was in the wrong business. He was a young man, brilliant. He wrote a novel. He was very literary minded, but he believed that a free press in India, and we're talking about the 1830s here. We're talking about a very early moment. He literally was involved in founding newspapers. And he believed there would be a check on imperial authority. He believed that
on English.
Exactly.
Yeah, he wanted the Indian language.
And that was not the way to get promoted or to get ahead in the civil service.
Lord Macaulay hadn't yet visited. I'm going to have to get to questions, Paulo. So Arunji asks, these stories are larger context or dark side. How have these ended up into children's literature?
Well, excellent question. Thank you so much, Ardati. So in the salons in Paris, when Galland was there in the early 1700s, the big fashion of the day were fairy tales. In 1697, we had Mother Goose and all these kinds of collections that eventually would give us stories like Sleeping Beauty and these kinds of stories. So like any publisher, the Veuve Bardin, the widow Bardin, the woman who published some of these volumes of the Arabian Nights, and before her husband, had to adapt the Arabian Nights into some kind of genre that would sell, right? So that's why in early 1700s France, they removed some of the darkness, the sex and the orgies and the homosexuality and all these kinds of things, and they tried to make it into children's literature. That's where the market was, and that was the craze, if you will, at the time in Paris, in Versailles, in the early 1700s.
Sachdev Ramakrishnan asks, is this type of storytelling unique with a main frame in these stories, and then there are lots of fragments, historical tales, love stories, tragedies, comedies, and often with different endings?
Well, I mean, unique, I don't know, because as we know with the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, we know that the Arabian Nights themselves were borrowing from some of the plots came from India via Persia, where they also would have had a Book of Thousand Nights or of Kings. They would have had their own story collections. And there are other story collections in the Arab world as well. There's even the 101 Nights. There's Tales of the Marvellous and News of the Strange. There are like these sister collections for the Arabian Nights that even share some stories and some plot elements and characters like the Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph. So I think maybe it's a human desire that we have. We love these big stories that gobble up these smaller little stories. And sometimes the smaller little stories are more marvelous and weird and magical and fantastical and subversive. And we need them. We need these stories. Even if the bigger stories sometimes turn out to be more, they're trying to order things a little bit. The smaller stories provide us a little bit of escape and rupture from these grand narratives. So yeah, I would say that we have them in quite a few different cultures.
And in China, we haven't touched upon the fact that some of the Arabian Nights was actually set in China.
Yes.
Subhadeep Majumdar asks, Paulo, Arabian Nights are through fantasy the reflection of our past. How much do you think literature meant at that very time? Is it an effort to replace the Arabic oral stories by generations of listening through writing and making them therefore forever?
That's an incredible question. I mean, for a long time, we imagined these stories were oral literature, and in fact, they were maybe condescended to. Now we realize the most prestigious mosques like Suleymania in Istanbul, but also Christian monasteries in the Levant, what we now call, Lebanon and Syria, possessed copies of stories from the Arabian Nights, and sometimes of the collection of the Arabian Nights itself. So I think there was perhaps a little more commerce between oral and written. And a good way to tell is when you're reading an Arabian Nights story and suddenly there's a long poem. That might be the scribe who heard the story, the oral story, and is trying to make the story more literary by adding poetry, for example. Having the characters quote certain poets and things like that. So I think there was this nice commerce, and that's why I use that. I like to remember the fact that these storytellers would often go to the mosques and take pages of the Arabian Nights, one or two at a time. So they would have their script for their storytelling sessions at the cafe. And then you can see the emendations, say in a funny voice or in a woman's voice. So there's a kind of, and then that goes back to the mosque, and then you can go in there and then take archive and see these annotations. So there's a kind of a nice interplay between the oral and the written in the creation of
performance. Finally, it's all about performance. I'm going to give you two questions together because they sort of take from what you've just said. One is Kajali Khanna asks, do you ever get lost while doing your research, and does it pull you away from your original aim? And Om asks, how do you or any other translator keep intact or do justice to cultural nuances of a language and tradition while translating these titles, as these may well be quite foreign to you?
Yes. Well, so I guess for sure, I think getting lost in the archives, I think the greatest joy about historical work, and I think Bill Dalrymple would agree, is that you often find things you're not looking for, and the things you thought you needed for your account turn out not to be there, but this is a good thing. In the case of Burton, I was able to find a dismembered fragments of something he plagiarized from another English translator. I wasn't expecting to find that. It was in a private collection. I guess the private collector died just before I had gone to the British Library, and I did a little computer search, and it turned out there were these new files that hadn't been there 2 years before. And I guess the family wanted a tax break, and lo and behold, proof that Burton had plagiarized his Arabian Nights. So you have to be open to finding what you're not looking for, and that might be the most important thing that shapes your story, your account, your history of literature. For a translation, I have to say I edited the translation and commissioned it in the new translation of Aladdin, but I didn't do it. I've translated other things. I'm a translator from other languages. Yasmin Seal did the amazing translation of Aladdin, this new translation published by Liveright, by Norton. And yes, I mean, from my own published translations, I can tell you that it's a very difficult thing. Translating is really retelling in a different cultural context, and you have to be very mindful of both cultures as you translate. It's like those people who put a rope between two buildings, and they it's a very delicate balance to survive that journey. It's not easy, and I think Yasmin did an absolutely brilliant job with Aladdin, and we're all looking forward to her translations of more stories from the Arabian Nights.
Roshni asks, but this is something you've already answered, but I'm just going to make it. Would you say history has been unkind to the Diab's contribution to Arabian Nights? Of course it has. But I'm going to ask you to end. There are more questions, but I'm going to ask you to end Yasmin's translation, Paulo, which is, and the new Aladdin, the movie, the Disney movie, has been based to a large extent on Yasmin's translation. And you can see that the princess is no more just a sweet, wonderful, helpless figure, but she's actually instrumental in the way that her fate sort of opens up. And is it, in your opinion, is it because Yasmin as a woman has sort of used that particular facility to be able to interpret it from her point of view, from a woman's point of view? Well, and therefore you find this very spectacular difference in this Aladdin version than the others.
I think what I would say is we have to remember the the story of Shahrazad answering tyranny with stories is one of the fundamental feminist stories of literature. And I think there are a lot of very strong women characters. Delilah the Crafty, Zumurrud, Marjana, the slave girl in Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. So many Bollywood movies have focused on. So I think we have to remember that these strong women characters, including in Aladdin, the Princess Badour in Aladdin, and even more importantly, Aladdin's mother, these are strong characters. I think that more than anything, I think Yasmin Seal is a great poet and a great writer. And I think she brings out the richness of the original story. It may have helped that she's a woman, but I also wouldn't want to reduce her accomplishments. I think that she's probably the most talented writer, period, of any gender, who has tackled the Arabian Nights in English and other traditions like French, or even if we went to an Urdu or Farsi, if we started thinking in different ways, there have been more talented people who have translated the Arabian Nights. But unfortunately, in English, we had all these imperialists and these adventurers and these tomb raiders who were actually translating. And I think that woman or man, I think she's the most gifted writer to embark on this process of translating these stories. So I'm not surprised that the characters are more rich. Both the male and the female characters, I think, come out more sophisticated.
I'm going to slip in a quick last question because of what you said about the English. So Tilotoma Shom asks, the erotica in the stories, did these get changed around when being translated as the cultural context of the languages changed, or was it responding to local taboos?
Yes, in fact, I mean, Burton, in many respects, a plagiarist, a sham, a fraud, also did not have very progressive views on race. In 1885, he did append an essay where he was trying in his own way to argue for the decriminalization of homosexuality in England when he published his translation of the Arabian Nights, and he appended that translation, this essay, to his translation. So I think every translator has adapted the sexual content to his or her own sort of time. And in Burton's case, that was the year that England decided to criminalize homosexual sex. This was a law that with the libel case that Oscar Wilde, who shared a publisher with Burton, would eventually be prosecuted under. So I think that, yes, I think that you have to remember it's kind of like the booksellers and the scribes of Cairo and Damascus before. Each of them were already adapting the erotica and the sexual content of these stories in the 13th century, in the 14th century, in the past. And it's not surprising that Marvellous in the early 1900s in France, or Burton 20 years before in England, did that for their own concerns, right? This is always the case, and you are going to see this in other contexts like India and Cairo and Persia today as well, in terms of the erotic content. Yes.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you for that wonderful session. I mean, truly, it's incredible to discover the story behind the stories, and perhaps someday, not Disney, but more mainstream. I mean, not mainstream, but the more adult part of these wonderful stories will be depicted and be portrayed quite differently.
So yeah, thank you.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Paulo.
Thank you. No, it's a joy always to be involved with the Jaipur Literature Festival. It's such a speaking of Shahrazad, it's one of the experiences that just deepens one's appreciation for the role of literature in society. So thank you for what you're doing online, for what you do in person, and it's just a pleasure to be part of it. It's my honor.
Thank you so much, as usual, for that fascinating conversation. And thank all our audience. I'm sorry I couldn't put all the questions, as usual, to Paulo, but I promise to do better next time. Thank you to our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. And please do remember to log in on Wednesday, the 5th of August, for another set of great sessions. We have the new great game, Bruno Macias and Shiv Shankar Menon in Conversation, a session that discusses how Asia can search for a constructive new equilibrium in the face of the growing tensions between China and its neighbors. And this is at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The second session on Wednesday, the 5th of August, will be The Red Carpets and Other Banana Skins, Rupert Everett in conversation with Sandeep Ray. An element of drama has always attended Rupert Everett, even before he swept to fame with his outstanding performance in Another Country. He had spent his life surrounded by extraordinary people and witnessed extraordinary events. He was in Moscow during the fall of communism, in Berlin the night the wall came down, and in downtown Manhattan on September the 11th. A superb raconteur and a keen observer of human folly, especially his own, Everett turns his life into a captivating story of love, fame, glamour, gossip, and drama. And this will be at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe. See you on Wednesday.